Good morning and welcome to the Subcommittee on East Asia and the Pacific for today's hearing. Senator Rubio has indicated to me that he'll be here shortly, but it's certainly okay for us to start the hearing, and I want to give a maximum amount of time for the committee to have a discussion. Slavery still exists. It exists around the world today, and it's something that we cannot allow to continue. Trafficking is modern-day slavery. We understand that, and thanks to the U.S. leadership, we have taken action not only in the United States, but have been a global leader in combating modern-day slavery and trafficking. I'm proud of the role that the U.S. Helsinki Commission has played. I have the honor this year to chair the U.S. Helsinki Commission. It rotates between the House and the Senate. My co-chairman, Chris Smith, has been one of the leaders on trafficking issues. But going back many years ago, the Helsinki Commission raised the issue of trafficking as a human rights issue and a matter in which the United States could play a major role. As a result of the hearings in our commission, the OSCE took major steps and now have real efforts to help all of the states, the 57 states in the OSCE, helping them deal with trafficking issues. But it led to the passage of the Victim of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act in 2000, and we now have what's known as the Trafficking in Persons Report that we receive every year. This report to me is extremely valuable. And whenever an ambassador from another country or a leader from another country is in my office, I look at this report, and it becomes part of the conversation that I'll have with that ambassador or with that leader as to what they are doing in regards to recommendations regarding trafficking. In 2010, we added the United States to one of the countries that we evaluate what we're doing in trafficking, because no country is perfect. Every country can improve. The Trafficking in Persons report has 4 categories in which countries are listed. Tier 1, which is those countries that are in basic compliance with international standards to combat trafficking. Tier 2 are countries that are not there yet, but we believe are on the right path towards accomplishing and meeting their international responsibilities. Tier 2 watch list, which are countries that are not moving in the right direction. They have made some progress, but they must do more to comply with their international responsibilities. And Tier 3, those countries that are out of compliance. If a country is in the Tier 2 watch list for 2 consecutive years, there's a requirement they be downgraded to Tier 3 unless a waiver is sought, which can last for only up to 2 years. If a country is in Tier 3, the consequences can be possible foreign aid restrictions. So it's an important guide for us to determine what to do. Now, trafficking can take many forms. We all know about young girls and boys that are trafficked for prostitution. That's a matter that should be of outrage to everyone. But we traffic also for labor issues, which also should be outrageous to everyone. So today's hearing is combating forced labor and modern-day slavery in East Asia and the Pacific. And for those who have been following the hearings of the subcommittee, you know we've had many hearings dealing with the rebalanced Asia. We've looked at it from many different points of view. We've looked at it from human rights and good governance. We've looked at it from the economic point of view. We've looked at it from the military security point of view. And our objective has been to strengthen the bilateral ties between the countries of East Asia and the Pacific and the United States, consistent with President Obama's policies. But our bilateral relationship is very much dependent upon the fundamental human rights, rule of law, and the dignity for vulnerable women, men, and children, the commitment made by the countries of East Asia and the Pacific. The International Labor Organization has come out with some startling numbers. 1/3 of the global illegal profits generated from the use of forced labor in the private sector are made in Asia and the Pacific. Illegal profits obtained through the use of forced labor in the private economy worldwide are estimated to be about $150 billion per year. Over 1/3 comes from the Asian-Pacific region. It's a problem that we need to focus on. The 20.9 million forced labor victims worldwide, 11.7 million are estimated to be in Asia-Pacific. More than half of the victims of forced labor come from the Asian-Pacific region. That's why we're holding this hearing. We're holding this hearing to get a better understanding of what can be done in regards to that issue. And let me point out, we are all consumers. And in many cases, we are buying products that have been produced in part by forced labor. We can be better in helping solve this problem of forced labor and modern-day slavery. The TIP report that I referred to had some disappointing downgrades of countries that are within the jurisdiction of this subcommittee. Thailand and Malaysia particularly. Thailand, a longtime ally of the United States, has been downgraded in this report. And Malaysia, which is a TPP aspirant country, has also been downgraded. We have several countries that are on the Tier 2 watch list: Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Marshall Islands, Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste. These are countries that we expect better from in order for a stronger bilateral relationship with the United States. So one positive sign I might point out is that China, that was Tier 3, is now on Tier 2 watch list. That is an improvement, and we hope that those improvements will continue. And I expect it had something to do with the fact that they have eliminated their, or at least made a commitment to eliminate their re-education labor provisions. So we have a panel of experts with us today who can help us sort out where we are on the forced labor and the trafficking in that regard. And I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses that are on the first panel. Scott Marcial, who has been a frequent visitor to this committee, we thank you for your participation. The Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs at the State Department, a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, previously served as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Indonesia. And he's joined by Lou Sidabaka, the Ambassador at Large for the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, served as Ambassador at Large and Senior Advisor to the Secretary and directs the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Person, previously served as counsel to the House Committee on Judiciary and one of our country's most decorated federal prosecutors at the Department of Justice. So we have two people who I think can help us greatly understand this. As I think both of you understand, the practice of our committee, your formal written statement without objection will be included in the committee record, as will the second panel's formal statements will also be included in the record without objection. So, Scott, you may proceed as you wish.
Thank you. Chairman Cardin, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on human trafficking in the Asia-Pacific region. It's really a privilege for me to be able to testify alongside Ambassador Sidabaka. He and his team, as you've mentioned, have done so much to combat trafficking across the region and around the world. I've worked on human trafficking issues both here in Washington and abroad, most recently as Ambassador to Indonesia. There, among many other anti-trafficking activities that we did, I was involved, for example, in the MTV End Exploitation and Trafficking campaign in 2012. It's an effort that the U.S. government has funded that's been very successful in raising awareness about the dangers of trafficking in Southeast Asia. Human trafficking, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, remains a visible and pressing concern in East Asia and the Pacific. While governments across the region are more aware of the issue than in years past, and many are doing more to combat it, progress to date is insufficient. Many governments in the region have developed legal and policy frameworks to deal with trafficking, and several have recently enacted comprehensive anti-trafficking laws. However, implementation of these laws is sometimes weak. And the insufficient progress on anti-trafficking efforts is sometimes linked to broader challenges facing some of these governments: inadequate rule of law, a weak justice system, and corruption. So the State Department seeks sustained progress on these issues because they're key to development and to democracy, and of course to more effective efforts against trafficking. So the EAP Bureau, and along with our colleagues from the JTIP office, work closely with foreign governments and international partners on strategies and programs to prevent trafficking, protect victims and vulnerable populations, and prosecute offenders. And in this, the TIP report is actually a very effective tool, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman. In his letter accompanying this year's report, Secretary Kerry stated that we face no greater assault on basic freedom than the evil of human trafficking. And in EAP, Assistant Secretary Danny Russell and I, and our ambassadors throughout the region, regularly meet and encourage governments to do more against trafficking. We use the TIP report and other tools working throughout Asia to increase public awareness, encourage better and more effective legislation, and promote greater efforts to prevent trafficking, investigate and prosecute trafficking crimes, and assist victims. Because so much of the work that we do is done by our embassies, I'd like to highlight a few examples of some of the work that our embassies in the field have been doing. For example, our embassy in Cambodia recently hosted the first ever anti-trafficking tech camp, where technologists and civil society organizations together developed creative, low-cost, easy-to-use solutions for areas with historically high rates of trafficking. Our embassy staff in Cambodia also worked with the Ministry of Labor there to develop an interactive voice response system that makes information on safe migration readily available by phone throughout the country. The embassy is also working with Cambodian authorities to develop policies and guidelines for conducting undercover investigations of human trafficking. Our embassy in Thailand is supporting NGOs that help migrants and trafficking victims get access to justice. Our programs are enhancing Thai investigation and prosecution capacity, and we're arranging to place a technical advisor in the Ministry of Labor to help guide policies on forced labor trafficking. In the Pacific Islands, our embassies are encouraging greater effort to tackle forced labor on fishing vessels. In the Marshall Islands, we're providing technical assistance in support of the government's drafting of anti-trafficking legislation and working to help the police and prosecutors understand how better to identify and prosecute trafficking crimes. In all of our embassies, our ambassadors and our embassy staff regularly engage with host government officials, civil society, and international partners to highlight the importance of increased anti-trafficking efforts. I can say from my own experience that this effort's well integrated into our embassy's overall plans as well as its daily work. Finally, in addition to bilateral efforts, we're acting at the regional level. With the TIP office funding, we supported the first ever ASEAN-United States joint regional project to combat human trafficking, and the American Bar Association's Rule of Law initiative to train heads of anti-traffic units from all 10 ASEAN countries. Looking forward, we're committed to continuing our work with governments throughout the Asia-Pacific region to help them more effectively combat human trafficking. EAP and the TIP office will continue to work closely together to assess the situation, develop programs and diplomatic strategies to better combat trafficking, and encourage governments to take action to prevent trafficking, protect victims, and prosecute traffickers. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Marcial. Ambassador Sida Baca.
Thank you, Chairman Cardin, for the opportunity to speak with you today. And just a note of personal privilege, Scott Marcial, not only with the MTV Exit program, but also in his time both in EAP and at Post, has been a real leader on this. I just wish that we had a photo of him at that MTV concert out on the stage to offer for the record. A few weeks ago, the Secretary of State released the 14th Annual Trafficking in Persons Report, what Secretary Kerry called a roadmap for the journey to freedom. This roadmap sets forth progresses and challenges in fighting modern slavery in 188 jurisdictions, including 29 in the Asia-Pacific region. And while there's progress, with more than 20 million estimated trafficking victims in the world and fewer than 45,000 victims identified, we know that we all have a lot more to do. In EAP, we see both sex trafficking and forced labor, even state-sponsored forced labor and the recruitment and use of child soldiers in some places, and pervasive victimization of migrants seeking better jobs. These are real people, people trapped in slavery, people in the sights of traffickers, people recovering from the trauma of being trafficked. They don't just impact our foreign policy, they touch our conscience. As you may know, we are working closely with the Vatican as they intensify their engagement on this scourge. And the words of Pope Francis, I think, are very appropriate when he says that human trafficking is an open wound on the body of contemporary society. So the United States is focused on identifying and seeking justice for victims, supporting survivors, and creating a world where people are no longer subjected to human trafficking. And that means developing common standards and getting governments to step up. While my written testimony deals in the efforts of a number of jurisdictions in EAP, along with several U.S.-funded initiatives to combat trafficking in the region, I'll highlight a few of those efforts and initiatives today. First, some laudable efforts. The Republic of Korea, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands all passed legislation to strengthen their legal frameworks. The Federated States of Micronesia initiated a landmark prosecution of a trafficker and implemented a national action plan. As you mentioned, Senator, we welcomed the formal abolishing of the re-education through labor system. However, we remain deeply concerned that forced labor persists in some government institutions in China, including re-education through labor facilities that have been reportedly converted into different types of detention centers. And so we'll be keeping close an eye on that. However, there were other issues in China as well. A second five-year plan came into operation that included labor trafficking and covered men victims, the accession to the Palermo Protocol, all good signs of forward progress. Elsewhere, we see mixed efforts. The government of Burma undertook efforts to improve anti-trafficking response, but some military officials and insurgent militia continued to subject civilians to forced labor and to recruit child soldiers. We're lending our support to help Burma improve its anti-trafficking response through training and a joint action plan on trafficking in persons. While we saw an uptick in public commitment by the government of Japan this spring, we are concerned about the steady decline in the number of victims identified in the last 9 years in Japan, despite no evidence of a diminution in the scale of the problem. 31 sex traffickers convicted in 2013, but no labor traffickers. And we know that the traffickers continue to use the industrial trainee and technical internship program there to subject victims to forced labor. We'll work closely with the Japanese government to enhance oversight of this program and improve their anti-trafficking response. And then there are some countries that did not demonstrate increased efforts to combat trafficking, countries that were downgraded. You mentioned Malaysia and Thailand. In Malaysia, a flawed victim protection regime that detains foreign trafficking victims in government facilities, sometimes for more than a year. We call upon the government to amend its laws and regulations to improve victim care, to enable all trafficking victims to work and travel outside of these facilities. And we have heard plans announced to allow certain restrictions to be lifted. We hope that we can work with them to turn those promises of future action into credible results. In Thailand, widespread official complicity continues to be a long-standing problem that remains a significant obstacle to anti-trafficking progress. And whether it's in the fishing industry, forced labor among migrant workers, or the sex industry, the magnitude of the human trafficking problem continues to be of great concern. I want to close, Senator, with a positive story, though. This year's report honored 10 trafficking in persons heroes who are making a difference in the front line. One such hero, Van Ngoc Ta, has personally assisted over 300 trafficking victims of forced labor in Vietnam and sex trafficking victims who had been taken to China. His team works with Vietnamese authorities to liberate victims and then represents them in court against their traffickers. I would offer for the record a recent article about Mr. Van's work, but his efforts show that homegrown civil society actors can move governments in Southeast Asia and elsewhere and are an inspiration to us all. We remain committed to supporting such heroes on the front lines, to support and sometimes nudge governments to prevent, protect, and prosecute for our shared goal, a world without slavery.
Well, let me thank both of you, not just for your testimony, but for your commitment in this area. It's well known, and we very much appreciate the fact that you have been very strong in raising these issues wherever you travel and making it clear that we expect greater progress. So I start with that. But my first question deals with whether we're making progress or whether we're moving in the wrong direction. And I say that because there were 4 countries that were, there were 4 countries that were downgraded in this report that are in our region. Only 2 countries upgraded. We mentioned China. Let me also mention Micronesia moving from Tier 2 watch list to Tier 2, which is certainly progress, and we very much acknowledge in both countries that progress was made in the right direction. I've already acknowledged that we've had countries that have been downgraded. 4 countries were downgraded in our region. Laos, Malaysia, Thailand, and Timor-Leste. There were 10 countries that are on Tier 2 that remain on Tier 2, so no progress made. There are 4 countries that are on Tier 2 watch list, no progress made. Burma, Cambodia, Marshall Islands, and Solomon Islands. Now, if no progress is made, those countries will be downgraded to Tier 3 as required under the law. So my question is, are we moving in the right direction? Because it looks like the TIP report would indicate that we have not made progress. In fact, there are more countries in worse condition this year than they were with the prior report.
Senator, I actually think that we have seen progress, and some of it is reflected in the report, some of as far as the tiers are concerned, but even in countries that did not necessarily raise up in a tier, we've seen progress. I hate to use the American grading system as the way that we look at it, but there's a difference between a B that is an 80 and a B that is an 89. They're still both Bs on your report card, but when you see a student that's starting to make that kind of progress, you can look at that trajectory in a good way. I think that's what we're seeing with a number of the countries in the region, and especially with the passage, for instance, of the new trafficking legislation in Papua New Guinea. It didn't get quite through the gazetting process. It didn't get through the entire process, but is something that we'll be looking at in next year's report. And that's a country that's on Tier 3, and yet we see the government starting to engage. We see that kind of energy. We see an openness, not just to U.S. involvement, but Australian and others who are willing and able to help. So I think that that's one of the places that we're really looking at. I think that what we've seen historically is that governments can look at their situation and make a decision to change. We saw that with Vietnam some years ago. And at this point, I think that we very much see them as a solid Tier 2 country. There was a few years when we'd look at it and frankly, we'd be wondering, is this still really a Tier 2 country? Should they be back down to Tier 2 watch list? Kind of where are they? We're seeing that solidifying as they're starting to work with civil society organizations like Blue Dragon, as they're starting to look at labor trafficking instead of just sex trafficking. So I think that we're seeing what to us looks like progress. I think that the 4 downgrades actually, in some ways, not only does that reflect the lack of progress in some of those countries, but it reflects good, solid reporting on the part of our embassies and otherwise. As we get more information, as we're engaging with them, we're learning more and more about the trafficking situation in these countries. So the notion of downgrades is not something that we necessarily see as a failure in the region. We see it as honest reporting that allows us and you and others to make a difference. And we've already heard that in the press coverage and some of the public statements that we're seeing out of Malaysia and other places, a commitment to going out and working.
Well, I would just observe, we absolutely believe that the TIP evaluations are honest reporting and honest grading. We don't want to play any, this is not on a curve. This is accurate grading that we expect that will continue. But having said that, it is disturbing to see with all of the global attention on trafficking, and there's been a tremendous focus on trafficking issues globally, not just the United States of America. And with all the technical support that's now available to deal with improving the trafficking issues, it is disturbing to see in the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, East Asia and the Pacific, that with all the priorities being given, we have not made the type of advancements that I think is expected. Now, there are 3 countries here that are TPP aspirants. 2 have dealt with their trafficking issues. And let me say, Vietnam's been under tremendous focus in this committee, and they have consistently been a Tier 2 country. Now, we'd like to see them a Tier 1, but they have made progress on the trafficking issues. I was in Vietnam this year, and we talked about the trafficking issues, and the country is very much focused on dealing with the issues. Brunei, which has serious human rights issues in trafficking, they have been consistent. Malaysia moved in the wrong direction. What does that mean as far as they're ready for TPP? Are they ready for TPP if they can't deal with their trafficking issues? It raises a question to me. So, Secretary Marcial, are we making progress, or are we moving in the wrong direction?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Clearly, we have a lot more work to do in Malaysia, and more importantly, the Malaysians have a lot of work to do on trafficking, particularly their treatment of trafficking victims. That's a big priority in the relationship, for sure. In terms of TPP, the whole idea of TPP, as you know, in addition to opening markets, is setting high standards, including in labor. And I mean, obviously the negotiations are still underway, but the intent is to have a very strong labor chapter in there. So we actually think the TPP process should reinforce, even though it doesn't have a TIP chapter per se, it does have very high standards, including on labor. So I think it should reinforce the effort. But clearly the Malaysians have a lot more to do.
One more observation on that. Many of us support a very high standard, ILO standards in regards to labor, in regards to TPP, but we also want to see that within the core agreement, with enforceability within the core agreement, which we didn't have in CAFTA. And with countries at the performance level of Malaysia on labor, it is just underscores, and their failure to respond to being identified for all those years on the watch list, they couldn't make the progress. So the TIP report and the spotlight of the TIP report was not enough to get Malaysia at the level that it needed to be. It's just a clear signal, at least to this senator, that the TPP needs to have enforceable labor commitments, because we haven't been able to make the progress by just putting a spotlight through the TIP report. Let me ask one more question. Senator Rubio had explained to me that he was going to be late getting here for personal reasons, and I fully understand that. I want to give him a moment to still catch his breath and thank him so much, because he's been one of the real leaders in the United States Senate on trafficking issues and on human rights issues in East Asia and the Pacific, and I very much appreciate his commitment to our mutual agenda to underscore and highlight these matters. I was in Moldova last week, and their leadership really committed to human rights issues, and I think they've made a lot of progress. I know it's not one of our countries, but it was interesting. They identified as the core area for improvement on trafficking would be to deal with corruption. And they've dealt with corruption. They have put some of their judges in jail because they were not enforcing the laws dealing with trafficking. And those who trafficked knew they could get away with their activities, but Moldova has made a commitment to change that. In the countries of East Asia and Pacific, particularly those that need to improve on trafficking, they have significant challenges on dealing with corruption. How well is that understood in these countries, that in order to deal with modern-day slavery, they have to deal with the corruption in their system?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll start. I think for a lot of these countries, and I've spent quite a bit of time in many of them, corruption is a huge issue. In some cases, it is arguably the biggest issue in the eyes of the people. Not only because of the impact on trafficking, but the impact on people's daily lives writ large, and certainly on rule of law and people's desire for justice. So I think the problem of corruption is very widely understood, And there's, in the places I've been, there's, tremendous public pressure and societal pressure on governments and political leaders to improve, to clean up on corruption, including because of its relationship to trafficking in persons. In my experience, it's a difficult challenge to tackle. It requires a tremendous amount of political will and a lot of effort over time, but it's critical not only on the trafficking front, but if these countries are going to achieve economic development and the justice that their people demand.
Thank you. Senator Rubio?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and both of you for being here. I want to just open, and I apologize for being a few minutes late, but, let me just begin with a statement about all this. Human trafficking, of course, is a monstrous crime that, which plagues the entire world, including, quite frankly, my home state of Florida, which is one of the top 3 destinations for human trafficking in the United States. Unfortunately, the populations of East Asia and the Pacific region are disproportionately affected by trafficking. The International Labor Organization estimates that there are currently 7.9 million victims of forced labor in the Asia-Pacific region. The recently released 2014 Trafficking in Persons report includes 4 Asian countries in the worst of the worst Tier 3 category: Malaysia, North Korea, Papua New Guinea, and Thailand. Numerous other Asian nations find themselves near Tier 3 in the Tier 2 watch list. That includes Burma, Cambodia, China, Laos, the list goes on and on. Today we'll explore, and have been exploring, the causes of human trafficking in the region, as well as the governments in that region and the responses that they've had in compliance with the laws and the expectations upon them. The United States has always been and will continue to be a leader in combating modern-day slavery in the world, and I appreciate the work both of you do with regards to that. We must highlight this issue, hopefully, at every level when working on a bilateral and multilateral levels with countries in this important region. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on this important topic, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I was going to start with Secretary Marcial. I wanted to ask you, how does our anti-human, and you may have answered this already, so I apologize, but how does the anti-trafficking platform, how does that work with the other priorities that we have in the region, such as defense or economic issues? How do we coordinate those sometimes competing interests, I suppose?
Thank you, Senator Rubio. Yeah, it's a very good question and a challenge for us. I guess what I would say is, in all of our relationships in the region, we obviously focus a lot on the diplomatic relationship, building people-to-people ties, trade relations, all of these sorts of things. But in every country where we see problems on human rights and/or trafficking more specifically, this is another important piece of what we do, and we make clear in our discussions with government officials that we want to build a closer relationship, but our ability to do so depends certainly to a significant extent on their willingness and ability to address these concerns, whether it's broad human rights or trafficking in persons. And then, in addition to that, in many of these countries, we'll have programs, either training prosecutors or police or judges, or often working with civil society, because civil society's role is critical in this, both exposing the problem, putting pressure on governments to do more, but then actually helping victims. So it's a combination of diplomatic pressure, making it a priority, plus specific programs. And I know Ambassador Siedebaca could talk more about that.
Senator, I think that one of the things that we're really looking at is how it works with our priorities, both around rule of law and human rights, and bringing those two together. I think that often human trafficking has been seen especially in Southeast Asia, as a transnational problem of moving people. And one of the things that I think that we've seen, often because, just to get into the weeds, it's the same reporting officers in our embassies that are doing the human rights report as well as the trafficking report. It brings a little bit of a harder edge to the human rights approach, and it brings a little human rights to the law enforcement approach. And I think that that's enabled us to have a conversation that's moving into each of these countries. We're starting to be able to deal with the Thai person who's enslaved in Thailand, the Vietnamese person enslaved in Vietnam, whereas 5 years ago, I think a lot of the countries were only focused upon the cross-border. What that's doing is it's allowing us to introduce other aspects of rule of law, whether it's the corruption issue, whether it's general judicial training, access to justice, et cetera. And I think that that kind of lifts all boats, that rising tide. So we're trying to make sure that it's incorporated in that way.
Let me ask you this. I've gotten a number of NGOs have expressed concern that during the Trafficking in Persons report, the regional bureaus include political considerations in the tier rankings and press the tip office to not downgrade certain countries. Is that accurate? Is that happening? Whoever has the answer, yeah.
Senator, actually, Ambassador Sita and I sat down on a number of occasions after our teams had worked through these to go through the countries. There were, some countries that we all agreed clearly fell into one category and others, and there were others that were a little bit closer. Was it a strong B or a weak A minus, as Ambassador Sita said. And basically, we went through and discussed. I wouldn't say debated, but just discussed what the countries had done and what they hadn't done. And our conversations were all about what had been done on trafficking. So we weren't saying, no, but, yeah, they didn't do anything on trafficking, but they're good friends. You can't downgrade them. We did not have that conversation. It was purely on
the
trafficking.
political considerations are not used in the tip process to distort the tier rankings.
I think actually we collectively, the State Department, do a pretty good job of keeping this focused on trafficking. And it helps that there's real criteria. So you can't really fudge it in that sense.
Because you know what I'm getting? I mean, some people are concerned, and I'm glad to hear your statement here today. It's important to have that on the record, that in fact there are some countries where because of certain geopolitical issues, there might be some internal pressure not to downgrade them or to move them off their current tier ranking. But your statement here today is that because of the criteria that's in place, that is not happening.
That's correct, Senator. And I think if you look at the fact that longtime friend and treaty ally Thailand was downgraded, as well as Malaysia, where the president had just visited and have a very good relationship. They were both downgraded.
Okay, and Ambassador, let me ask this question about China. And again, I apologize. You may have answered this already before. In the 2013 report, China was automatically downgraded to the lowest level of Tier 3 because it had been on the Tier 2 watch list for 2 consecutive years, and by the way, waived for 2 more years, and had not made any improvements. In the 2014 report, they were upgraded back to the Tier 2 watch list. So what exactly did China do? What improvements did they make in that reporting period that allowed them to be upgraded to Tier 2?
Senator, there's a few things that we were really looking at last year, especially the re-education through labor camps, the state-sponsored forced labor that we saw in China. And that was one of our biggest recommendations for the Chinese. And we saw movement from them this last year.
I'm sorry to interject. Is that actually happening, or are they running that program under a different name? I mean, is there real evidence that they've dismantled those programs?
We've seen evidence that they've dismantled the main program, but we are concerned that it not be shunted over to other re-education camps, whether it's drugs or other morality offenses or things like that. And it's something that we're very much looking at very closely, because I think we share the skepticism to make sure that this is a trust but verify.
Okay.
On the other hand, we see other things that they have done, such as acceding to the Palermo Protocol, the issuance of a new 5-year plan that directly went to some of the issues that we had raised. Their previous structure did not allow for the identification of male victims at all. So they were having cases where men would be brought out of mentally retarded or drug-addicted men brought out of a brick kiln where they'd been held for 5 years, kidnapped off the street, and they weren't charging that as trafficking because their definitions, their laws, just didn't see those men as trafficking victims because they weren't women being taken across an international border. They've changed that now. They've changed the structures so that you're bringing in the All China Women's Federation to do victim protection at the beginning of the cases. All of those, we think, are enough of a change that we did not feel that a Tier 3 was appropriate for China. We're not saying, however, that this is a feel-good story. This is not a Tier 2. This is certainly not a Tier 1. This is just enough to come off of Tier 3, and we're going to be really looking at this.
Let me just highlight one more thing that I'm hearing from NGOs with regards to China, and that's that many students from Chinese vocational schools are being forced to work in factories as interns, performing work that's not related to their major and, quite frankly, has no educational benefit. These students risk not receiving their diploma if they refuse to work. Is that something that we are looking at and taking into account, that they are using these sorts of forced labor situations hidden and disguised as some sort of vocational training program?
We haven't seen it necessarily rise to the level of abuse that we've expressed concern about in the Japanese training and technical internship program, or in the Uzbek use of the students for the cotton harvest and others. But it is something that we're looking at, and something that we continue to keep an eye on. Again, we don't want there to be ways to try to get around getting rid of the RTL camps by coming up with other forced labor situations.
Is that okay? In your testimony, you noted that foreign governments tend to focus, and I think this was you, yes, Ambassador, it was you that said this in your testimony, that foreign governments, and you alluded to it a second ago, they tend to focus their anti-trafficking efforts on sex trafficking, which is horrifying, but there's also the issue of labor trafficking that has not, sometimes people don't think about that as equally horrifying in many cases. So how are we engaging with foreign governments? And you started to touch upon that a moment ago. Can you describe how we engage with foreign governments to explain that they are, because that's where I think you're running into a lot of the situations you just outlined a moment ago. What are we doing to kind of create more awareness on their part that labor trafficking is also trafficking, that sex trafficking is horrifying, we want to put a stop to it, but also the labor trafficking element of it as well?
I think this is actually one of the biggest issues, that the cultural change that we're moving into with these governments. A lot of folks in the Southeast Asia have had a real learning curve, especially around the domestic servant issues, whether it's in Singapore, Hong Kong, other places, Malaysia, where there's such a strong culture of bringing in foreign domestic servants. Those cases often, when they manifest, to the degree that they're ever dealt with, get dealt with as assault cases. And so we've been going in almost on a case-by-case basis and doing the legal arguments with these governments to say, no, this case under international law is a trafficking case. What we've also been doing, frankly, is to then harness the anti-trafficking community in the United States so that we end up getting experts, whether it's folks from the Freedom Network or other consortia of the people who are doing the hard work, and we send them out to the countries. Some of the folks from the Florida Coalition, for instance, have been able to travel in that way. And I think that what it's doing is it's starting to get to the prosecutors and the police. I think the next step is going to be the judges. The judges don't still seem to understand this, but we're kind of lining them up and knocking them down one by one. The Thailand downgrade, I think, will speak volumes in the region because we made it very clear in the narrative that there had been work done over the last year against human trafficking. It just had been almost exclusively done in the sex industry. And while we want that, and while we laud the people who are doing that in Thailand, the crushing numbers actually show up in forced labor. And the fact that we were willing to downgrade such an important country, largely over labor trafficking, hopefully sends that signal.
I just have a brief comment and a quick question. Or did you need, no, just to come on, one more point. You just spoke about the Thailand thing a moment ago. Just here domestically, I think one of the most important things we need to continue to do, and this is more of an editorial statement, is we need to make it very clear there's nothing culturally acceptable about going to these other countries as Americans and participating in these sorts of things. I mean, there's this attitude that I've run into now and then where things we would never do in this country is okay if we do it somewhere else, because in those countries it's culturally or acceptable in some way. And I think you've seen this reflected sometimes in popular culture, but even anecdotally among people. And I think one of the things we have to be very clear in that there is nothing acceptable about us or Americans going abroad to one of these countries and going into brothels at all, not to mention those that have people underage working there. And I think that's important to point out, because we do find the presence of Westerners and Americans frequenting some of these places that we've talked about in the sex trafficking industry, and we should truly try to stigmatize that in our society. The last question I had, this is for you, Mr. Secretary. As the United States considers increased military engagement with Burma, how is the issue of child soldiers factoring into those conversations, and will that be a priority for us moving forward as we have those conversations on increasing that military relationship?
Senator, yes, very much so. We've had, there's a lot that we want the Burmese military to do as part of the country's broader reform effort, and we have highlighted to them the issue of child soldiers as well as use of forced labor. We've seen some movement. I think there were a couple hundred child soldiers who were released, and a willingness to talk about it. A lot more that needs to be done. Our Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Tom Malinowski, along with our Deputy PACOM Commander, General Crutchfield, were in Burma a couple weeks ago, met with the military and talked about a range of human rights issues, including this. So we've made it very clear this is hugely important, and we'll continue to do that.